what's going on, folks? Welcome to another episode of the Adventure One podcast. So today's topic is going to be a little bit different from some of the other ones I've talked about. I'm talking about reloading today, and it's a topic that somehow I don't think I've actually ever talked about on this channel. Maybe I've hinted at it, or I've said something like, hey, it was cool that I shot a deer with one of my own hand loads, stuff like that, but I've never really gotten into the topic of reloading. And obviously it's a very complex topic. It's most similar to engineering, but there is a little bit of a science and a little bit of an art and a little bit of strategy to it. So it's something that, man, for a while, ever since I started getting into building my own arrows, working on a lot of my own stuff, cutting my own meat, it's just one of those things where anytime you can do it yourself and kind of make your own version of something that you could regularly just buy off the store, it always makes it mean just a little bit more. Sometimes you can save a lot of money doing it. With the case of reloading, a lot of people will get into it for that reason. I'm not sure that that's always true. Some people will say, hey, I want to make rounds that are better than factory rounds, so that's why they'll get into it. Some people say, hey, I shoot a lot, so I want to reduce the cost. That's why they'll get into reloading. Both those things can be done, but aren't guaranteed. It kind of all depends on how you source components, how you work on stuff, how much time you put into it, how you value your time, especially. But the one thing, once you get into reloading and stick with it, that you absolutely will do is you will probably shoot a little bit more. Just because instead of just going to the range every once in a while to practice, now you got to test your loads. And you're paying attention when you're shooting more as well. You're not just, hit or miss. You're paying attention to the recoil. You're looking at your brass. You're looking at your primer. You're trying to figure out all the detailed nuances of how everything is working. So I got into reloading probably, I still don't know if it was one of the best times or one of the worst times. It was right during COVID, right at the beginning of it, when everybody started panicking about lockdowns, people started buying ammo, and right when I got into it, all the components I needed were mostly available, and then they started drying up. So right off the bat, I was able to get all my tools very easily. I got the Hornady lock and load press. I know some people love that press, some people hate that press, but for me, it was just a very simple single stage. It's pretty obvious how to use it. Everything is very mechanical. There aren't too many adjustments, and the ones that are on there are really big and obvious. So kind of got locked in, I guess, to the Hornady system of accessories, dies, tools. At the time, there was kind of an online deal that content creators could get a little bit of a deal on Hornady products. It wasn't that great, and so I ordered a lot of stuff through there, and it was awesome because I did save some money for sure. But the problem was I was trying to order this stuff at the exact same time the industry was panicking. So it took a long time to get some of these components. I think there are some 44 MAGNUM bullets that are technically still in open order from over a year ago that I've never received. So should probably follow up about that because that's probably not going to happen. But all that to say, I got into it at a weird time, and it was right as everybody was freaking out about all this stuff. And the first load I built was, I think it was my 270 hunting load. I really liked it. And then I wanted to do a little bit more. I wanted to change powders. And then I couldn't find the powder I wanted. Then I was getting into 6.5 Creedmoor competition shooting and realized the powder I had was a great powder, and the bullet I had was a great bullet, and I was able to achieve a very, very accurate load, but after about 700 yards, it just ran out of gas. But at 100, 200, 300, man, that thing was just punching just nasty, ragged holes. So I ended up actually giving those loads to Kyle because he got an AR-10 that he was hunting with, and he wasn't going to be shooting, beyond, 400 max with that thing for hog hunting. And so those loads, I think he's actually killed 2 pigs with them, and they've been pretty accurate and pretty effective. But all that to say, I wanted to adjust my 6.5 Creedmoor load. Then I couldn't find the right powder for the bullet that I was wanting to use. And I've run into many, many of those troubles. And so I just wanted to focus on one today that I kind of found a workaround a way to get around the supply shortage of components and make something that still works great for my purposes. So one of the most difficult things to source that I've seen has been the common pseudo-military calibers. The cartridges that are most common throughout the world that everybody shoots because, well, that's what the U.S. military went with, and so it ramped up the industry, so now it kind of becomes a standard, and that's 308, 9mm, and 5.56 or 223. Now, 308, obviously, there are a lot of hunting-specific loads there, and it's kind of the military's been weaning off of the 308 for a long time, but obviously still used in a lot of other stuff. But I don't know too many people who actually go out with, FMJ, like M80 ball rounds, and shoot them out of a 308. I think most people I know who shoot 308 are primarily hunters. So they're not really looking at the mil-spec stuff anyway, but it does affect the whole world of brass, of powders, of primers, and primers have been horrible to get. It's been the hardest thing for me to find. Powders have been hard to find too, but every once in a while, it seems like somebody ships a whole pallet of stuff, somebody ends up with something. If you're a little bit flexible, you can probably find a powder that will work for your purpose. It may not be exactly what you're hoping for, but you'll find something that will work. But primers, you just gotta generally find the right thing. And so I've gone to a few stores and I've kind of found a way to run a route of check the only 2 or 3 stores that are ever actually getting primers, see what they're getting in. They have shot shell, like 209 primers all the time. But again, I'm not reloading shot shells. It's not a cost effective thing for me. It doesn't make a lot of sense and isn't suited to my press anyway. So the fact that they have shotgun shell primers, it doesn't really matter to me. So I'm after small rifle, large rifle, and small pistol. I don't really shoot any large pistol. Yeah, I do have some big revolvers, 357, 44 mag that does use that kind of stuff, but those aren't things that I'm really reloading for right now. I went ahead and bought all the dies just so I'm set up if I ever need to go there, because I'd rather have the tools and make an active decision to start loading that caliber rather than find myself in a position where, well, I want to, but I can't. So I have picked up a couple of those, large Magnum pistol primers, that kind of stuff. But other than just having a box or 2 on hand, it's not something I'm using really at all. So what's been hard for me was finding small pistol primers, which is commonly used in 9mm, 380, most of your small pistol rounds. I have been able to get powder for these pistol loads, but not through a very conventional way, doing a little bit of horse trading. But I'm from North Texas. That's just what we do, right? So I was able to find, I think, a specialty Magnum powder that a coworker needed, and he found some pistol powder, and so we just swapsies made it happen. But I haven't actually seen, I was looking for tight group or bullseye or a very common kind of minimalist, little goes a long way type of pistol powder that I can load for 9mm, and I just hadn't been able to find it. Then when he found some tight group, it all worked out. What I've been able to find actually very commonly is bullets. I've been shocked actually at how easy they've been to find despite all this. Originally going into all this stuff, a lot of the rifle bullets, especially like the high-end match stuff, some of the 6.5 competition bullets, some of the nice 223 bullets, those have been hard to find. But a lot of the cheap pistol plinking bullets have been pretty easy. At first, when I saw a box of Barry's bullets, which if you're not familiar with Barry's, they look like FMJ bullets, but they're not really FMJ bullets. They are plated. So it is a lead slug that is swaged into the correct shape and then basically put in a copper wash. So it is chemically replacing the outermost level of lead with a very, very thin layer of copper. It looks just like an FMJ, except for the back of it. You'll notice it has copper all the way around it instead of a exposed lead rear end. So it makes it, not as hard, not as durable, probably not as consistent, not as accurate. But if these are just literally, banging steel at 10 yards with a pistol, plinking sort of stuff, it's fine for that. Even some competitors use them. I think they're not really competition grade bullets. unless it's purely a just like shoot fast and accuracy, isn't quite as important type of competition, where it's more like, very close up tactical drill sort of stuff. They're probably fine for that. But I've been able to find Barry's bullets. Then I saw some of the Hornady stuff coming back online, seeing their just standard 115 FMJ and 124 FMJ start showing up in stores. I like the 115 just because if it's purely just for practice and mechanics, keep the recoil light, keep your powder charge light. No reason to go heavier than you need to. As long as it cycles the gun fine, keep everything light. And then recently, through one of my favorite online shops, Palmetto State Armory, I saw bulk sets of 9mm bullets from AAC. And I saw AAC and I immediately thought, awesome, that's the Advanced Armament Corporation. That is a great company that makes high quality stuff. I didn't know they made bullets. I knew they made some rifle parts, and I knew they made a lot of great suppressors. Didn't know they made bullets, but maybe they're getting into that now, or maybe they just private labeled something else. Only after I placed my order did I actually look back on the site and realize they're marketing it as AAC, America's Ammunition Company. And I realized, oh, that's not the high-end AAC that I was thinking of. What is this? What is America's Ammunition Company? And I dug a little further, and then I also found on the same page, it said America's Ammunition Company, them using that as a tagline, Advanced Armament Corporation. So I realized that this is probably a new line for AAC, Advanced Armament Corporation, which was previously a part of the kind of Remington collective. When Remington went bankrupt, I think it was owned by Freedom Group. When Remington went bankrupt, everything that was associated with Remington, so that was Bushmaster, that was Marlin, that was Remington Ammo, all these kind of branches and divisions were all just kind of scattered to the breeze, sold at wholesale. And I think the holding company of Palmetto State Armory bought one portion of this, including the AAC brand name. Now, these bullets, I don't know that AAC, Advanced Armament Corporation, ever actually had a bullet factory. I guess I assumed that, I don't know if they were under the same group as Remington. Maybe these are actually Remington UMC bullets. I'm still not really sure. I need to look at like city of origin, see if I can figure that out, if they're made in Arkansas, if they're made up north somewhere. All that to say, once I got them, I'm still not really sure who's actually making these things, if it's Palmetto State Armory, if it is Advanced Armament Corporation, if those are now one and the same, if some private label company is just OEMing this for PSA/AAC, who knows? They're 9mm bullets. They're going to hit stuff. They're going to fly. They're going to work. They don't look like anything fancy, but they just look like regular FMJ plinking rounds. So all that to say, I've been able to find bullets fairly well. I've got several hundred of bullets sitting there waiting to go. And I've been a little range gremlin scooping up brass every time I go. So I've got enough range brass that's clean enough. I've started cleaning it with the ultrasonic. I do resize the brass. For some people, 9mm plinking brass, reloading it, resizing it every time could be considered a waste of time. Some people are just going to say, yeah, it's as long as it, fits in the press and I can load it, we're just going to run it. I am new enough to reloading that I'm still trying to play it really conservative. Yeah, I know I'm probably spending more time than necessary, but especially when I'm picking up range brass where I don't know if this is once fired, if this is 5 times fired, where I don't really know what it is with the origin. I'm just going to go ahead and resize it. And then I'm going to full length trim the case. And then I'm also going to chamfer and deburr. So that means I'm definitely going a little slower. I may get into a progressive press at some time in the future, just especially if I start shooting a lot more pistol ammunition. For rifle, I still like kind of going slow, being precise, because I'm not just going out and blasting 100 rounds of rifle ammo at a time like I am with pistol. So I have everything I need, bullets, cases, powders, except primers. So when I go do this loop looking for primers, I have not been able to find the small pistol. but I did recently start seeing MAGNUM small pistol. So I think one of the reasons that primers in general have been hard to find is just because there's so few primer manufacturers in this country, and importing primers takes a long time and is very, very difficult. I know there's a lot of stuff even just sitting across the border in Canada that can't come over just because of the import difficulties through ITAR and through a lot of just shipping regulations, because these things are, pretty fragile, pretty dangerous to ship, pretty dangerous to manufacture. So there are so many ammo companies that load stuff, that make bullets, that make powders, that make cases, but don't make primers. So the supply of primers has primarily been going to big wholesale ammo manufacturers. Hornady is a great example. They make bullets, they make cases, they have great relationships with powder brands, even to blend their own, which I don't think is their own. I think it's just they found a nice blend of some other powders and marketed it as their own, called Superformance. But Hornady does not make primers. So every Hornady box of ammunition you see is using somebody else's primer. And there are tons of brands just like that. I think CCI, Federal, Winchester are pretty much the big primer manufacturers. Obviously, Remington used to make a lot. I don't even know if that factory is running right now. So the supply has been difficult. And I think most of the common stuff is going to ammunition manufacturers. And so the small pistol Magnum is just one of the most kind of uncommon, unused primers that's available. So I think that's one that, the factories aren't using up the total supply. So the remainder is making it to consumer shelves. So finding this, I knew it would technically fit in a 9mm. I knew it is a small pistol primer. I know the physical dimensions will fit. And a Magnum small pistol primer is really intended for something more like a 357 Magnum, maybe a really hot 38 special load or a 38 super, something like that. It's not very common in kind of the mainstream economics of most modern shooters. The Magnum designation also doesn't really change how it fits, or doesn't necessarily change compatibility, but it does imply that it is a hotter primer. It is designed to fire hotter to ignite slower burning or large volumes of powder a little bit better. A great example of that is you can use the same powder in a 308 as you can in a 300 Winchester Magnum, depending on which powder you're using. Not all are completely crossover, but you can use the same powder, but almost always that load is going to recommend a large rifle primer for the 308, but a large Magnum rifle primer for the 300 Winchester Magnum, just because you're igniting a much larger volume of powder, so you want to get a hotter spark to get a more complete burn of that powder. So can I take that Magnum primer and run it in my dinky little 9mm plinking loads? It seemed like maybe this would be dangerous. Maybe I'd blow my hand off. Hopefully not. But just based on the physics, I realized, yes, I'm going to be getting a hotter spark. I'm going to be getting higher pressure in the cartridge. But I'm not trying to really hit an exact velocity. I don't have a lot of requirements in terms of in-air ballistics. So all I need to do is worry about what's safe in the chamber. So the other way to back down chamber pressure and all that is just to reduce the charge. So I started with the data from my current 9mm load, which I was using about 4.6 grains of tight group powder. And I wanted to create some scaled back loads to test these Magnum primers. And first off, every single reloading manual I've ever looked at has some warning about do not use loads for standard primers with Magnum primers, because you are now making it quite a bit hotter. That's definitely dangerous. A lot of these load manuals tend to be pretty conservative. And if you're loading something to max and then you swap out a primer, you could get yourself in a very, very dangerous overpressure situation, because these primers definitely are hotter. So they say absolutely do not view them as interchangeable. They don't say don't use them. They say don't use them with the exact same load. So I took my original load data and said, okay, this primer is hotter. I know my load isn't a max pressure or extremely hot load in the 9mm range. I think even the bottle of powder recommends 4.8 grains of type group, and I'm using 4.6. So I'm kind of like right in the middle of that bell curve of, what most people are probably using. Maybe I'm even slightly conservative on that. So I knew, I don't want to go hotter than where I am, but I knew I wasn't in an extremely dangerous situation, and that's why I was willing to try this. Previously, I had also found I was trying to make just a really wimpy load just to kind of figure out what is the minimum my kind of largest full-size gun will cycle a 9mm if I want just a super dinky, low recoiling practice round. And I found that at 4.3 grains with the standard primer, it would shoot fine, but every once in a while, about once per mag, or maybe a little more often, maybe every 10 rounds or so, I would get a stovepipe. So it means it was cycling it, but it was just barely operating the slide enough to eject the round. And so that's why I kind of realized for a practical load, I wanted more power than that. But I realized that was kind of my bottom threshold for a standard primer. So that gave me a really good idea of kind of an acceptable range. And so that bracket from 4.3 to 4.6, what if I just took that whole bracket and moved it down a little bit? So starting from that 4.6 kind of go to where I was already happy, I created scaled back loads that were kind of minus 5%, minus 10%, and minus 15%. So approximately, I rounded a little bit to make the numbers a little easier to work with, easier to measure on a scale. So I loaded different groups, and this is important. Anytime you're reloading, don't ever just come up with one formula and say, okay, that's what it is, we're going to lock it in. Always bracket it and test kind of either side of what you want to do. Because you may learn that, I got something to work, but I was at the very bottom range of where it worked. Or I was at the top range, I was dangerously pushing it, and I didn't realize that, hey, something just slightly under could have been better. So always kind of bracket it and be willing to to throw out one side of that equation, right? So that's kind of why I said, let's make loads at minus 15%. So that was roughly a 4-grain powder charge, minus 10%, so that was my 4.2, and then minus 5, which was my 4.4. Again, roughly, not exactly if you're trying to fact check my numbers, if you're that much of a dork about this. The point was just scaled down loads so that I could safely test what would work without ever approaching kind of my full charge load. And I'm very glad I did that, because my 4.0 loads felt like they had about as much recoil as my full power loads, my full power 9mm. And I think some of that is just this Magnum primer is a little bit snappier. And when I say snappier, I don't necessarily mean more recoil. I just mean the recoil impulse tends to be faster. And I think that's just a hotter spark igniting the powder a little bit faster. It felt like a regular recoiling round. Looked at the primers, they all looked fine. I did have one stovepipe. It was on my very last round. So sometimes when you get a stovepipe on the very last round, it can just be because it didn't have another round in the magazine kind of helping push it up that it was trying to load in. I've realized that's the most common time for me to get a stovepipe. So it's not necessarily indicative of a weak load, but it kind of helped inform me that maybe I was a little bit on the weak side. I was definitely not on the overpowered side at that point. So I went on to test my next group, and that was my 4.2. And so when I was shooting those, they all worked reliably. I got decent accuracy out of all of them. The recoil felt just like my normal loads, maybe a tiny bit more if I'm really reading into it, but if they were mixed in a magazine, would I be able to tell the difference? Probably not. Like, for all practical purposes, they felt about the same as just my regular plinking loads. I even brought some factory just CCI Blazer ammo with me, and so I would shoot a couple rounds from my loads, then shoot a couple factory loads, and even try it in 2 different guns just to see how it felt. And the differences between the 2 guns was bigger than the differences between the two types of ammo. So all that to say, I think I'm right in the range of where I felt comfortable with it. Looking at the primers, they were starting to crater just the slightest bit. And so crater is basically when the primer pops, you kind of see, instead of just an indentation, you also see kind of a bulge around the edges of the indentation where back pressure is kind of pushing back against the breech, against the firing pin. So I was starting to see just a tiny bit of that, not enough that was concerning. And I think some of that is just these primers are thicker. And so when I'm hitting them just with a standard size firing pin, it is pushing in a little bit more, and there's just more material. And so I think I'm more likely to see that from kind of the higher pressure of the primer. But it doesn't necessarily mean there's an issue. A lot of times it's kind of a yellow light just to say, hey, be paying attention now. You're kind of getting into a zone where it's not dangerous, but you may be approaching something dangerous. My accuracy with these was also a hair worse than with the previous load. And some of that may have been me. You know, I was only running 5-round tests, 5 rounds in one gun, 5 rounds in another gun. So it may have all been me. It's kind of hard to tell with such a limited test. But it just felt, I don't know, not quite as controlled as the other one, but I did like the power level a little bit more. So that was interesting to note, those 2 data points. Then I moved up to my 4.4 and I tested that. It definitely felt a tiny bit snappier. Again, not bad. Not even like a 9mm NATO or a plus P load, which the 9mm NATO is basically a plus P load. It's a little higher pressure than regular plinking ammo. And trying to catch the brass to look at some of those primers, I definitely saw some cratering on those. And then on the very last round, so I was testing 10 of each load. On round number 10, I actually split the case. It didn't feel off. Nothing felt weird. But after, I was looking at my brass, a lot of times I'm, like I said, the little gremlin scooping up my brass at the range. And yeah, a lot of that's because I'm trying to be thrifty because I want to reload it. But it's also, especially when I'm doing these reload tests, I want to look at the brass and just see if there's anything strange, see if there's any cases that are bulged, see if there's anything that's happening that can tell me what the round is doing in the chamber other than just how it felt shooting it. And on my last case, I split the case, almost the whole length. It was about 2/3 of the length of the case that was split. So to me, that's definitely a red flag saying, hey, there's an overpressure situation. I'm running this through, I think that was actually through my Walther, which is a tighter chamber than usual, and that's a very accurate gun because of that tighter chamber. And I think that contributes to a slightly higher pressure because of the tighter chamber. So I realized, this round, maybe that was just an old case that's been reloaded 5 times and it was about to give up anyway, but it was this higher pressure round that did it. So I realized, at this point, I didn't want to go there. 4.4 was definitely higher than I was comfortable with. The 4.2 was probably okay, but when I thought back about it, I'm like, well, the 4.0 worked. It worked almost perfectly. There was one questionable stovepipe. So after looking at all the data, I decided just to split the difference. And so I ended up at 4.1. And what's funny about all of this is before I started this, when I was trying to learn if this was even safe, if this was even a road I could go down, I saw on some forum somewhere, somebody was like, oh yeah, you can totally do this, just always work up. And somebody else said, no, I just load a half grain down and it's fine. I did it the proper way in starting low and working up, but where did I end up? My original load was 4.6. I ended up at 4.1. It was exactly a half a grain down from my starting point by switching out primers. So I'm not saying do that. With ammo, especially kind of creating your own recipes, this all depends on what powder you're using. Some powders burn faster than the others. Some, a half grain down, may still be very hot, may still be very dangerous. It could blow up your gun. So I'm definitely not saying do that. But that is where I ended up from starting low and working up. I could have even started lower if I was trying to really play it safe and be conservative. I felt pretty confident that I would be fine. But it was an interesting learning experience just to see the difference in going by the book, using all these standard, very safe, conservative methodologies versus kind of forum rumor and just kind of FUD lore where it ended up in terms of like, just do this. A lot of times it's pretty close, but a lot of times you're shortcutting the actual learning and knowledge and some of the safety aspects if you just say, just do this, and you just use somebody else's recipe. You should never use somebody else's reloading recipe without at least questioning it and trying to, to learn the parameters and learn, hey, is this a really aggressively hot load? Is it a conservative load? You should never just take it at face value. So I was able to test this out, get something confirmed. And so now I am back in the business of loading 9mm. Now with this load, do I trust it enough to be like an everyday carry load, like something that I would use for self-defense or home defense, or for if I was going to hunt with a 9mm for some reason? Do I trust it for that? No, I absolutely don't. I'm using weird data that does not match any factory ammunition specification. No factory reloads their ammo quite like this. They recommend not to, but it absolutely works. So it's not something that I would use to protect my life, to use to protect somebody else, even to hunt reliably. But if I'm just looking for plinking ammo and I just need the ammo to work and generally be at least as accurate as I am, I think this is a go. This is a win. So I went ahead and loaded up 150 rounds last night. I look forward to going to the range to shooting it more, just to get a better feel for it across. When you shoot 30 rounds, you kind of get a decent feel for it. But when I shoot 150 and then compare that to factory loads, I'm going to get a real feel for it. But the moral of the story is, even with something as kind of mathematical and precise as reloading, there is some room for creativity. There is some room for creating your own recipe, figuring out what will work. Always document what you're doing. Always be careful. Always be conservative. But in these days of a crazy ammo shortage, you can find combinations that will get you back in business. Hopefully, I'll be doing some more reloading discussions in the future. I have learned a whole lot about it. I wanted to kind of do an episode about getting into reloading, but I realized with such a interesting subject and one that's potentially dangerous if you're doing it wrong, I didn't want to just spout out a whole bunch of information about, all the things I know and come off as a know-it-all when I was pretty new to the hobby. But now I've been doing this for almost, I guess, about 2 years now. And I started very by the book with some very normal, consistent, kind of boring loads that ended up being very accurate and working well. And now I'm at the point where I'm getting creative. I'm coming up with different recipes. I'm finding things that work that aren't necessarily supported by a book, but aren't necessarily bad, and figuring out how to balance all that. That's kind of the art and the engineering of it, and that's why I like it. So I feel like now that I'm at that point, I'm comfortable enough to start talking about this stuff. But as always with reloading, be careful, man. It can be very dangerous if you do it wrong. But if you do it right, it can be a lot of fun. It can be interesting. You can build ammo cheaper. You can build ammo better, and you can get out and shoot more. So hopefully more reloading topics to come. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Until next time, stay safe, be free, and never stop seeking adventure.